Please get your wine and cheese discreetly so we can get started. On behalf of the Arnold A. Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies, welcome to a discussion on one of the highest priority international issues of the moment. The civil war in Syria is a political crisis, an issue in international security, a humanitarian disaster. Where are the levers for resolving the crisis inside and outside the country? And particularly, what can outside intervention accomplish? What should the international community do about it? And what stands in the way of implementing the answers? There are a lot of impassioned views on the subject, but not many that are carefully informed by expertise, direct experience, and wise judgment. And this evening, I think we will get some of that, some well-informed views on the nature of the problem and the obstacles to its solution. We're fortunate to hear from the horse's mouth on the subject someone who has been deeply involved recently, Professor Jean-Marie Guéhenno. For those few of you who don't know who he is, please refer to the information in your programs. I will not repeat it, but his illustrious career both in the service of France, the United Nations, and Colombia, I think, well qualifies him to speak to us tonight. And Pali Mukhopadhyay, who has a lot of experience in problems not exactly the same, but with similarities in some respects, will engage some of Jean-Marie's observations. So, Jean-Marie.
Thank you, Richard, for your kind words. I'm fortunate to speak about Syria today because, in a way, I mean, this week, the last few days, they may be, I mean, a very important moment for Syria. A few days ago, as you know, there was a meeting, when it lasted actually several days in Doha, which led to the creation of a coalition, a national Syrian coalition, which is an effort to bring the whole of the opposition together, and especially the internal opposition. And it's too early to tell whether what will be the long-term implications of that, but they may be significant. One immediate consequence was actually this afternoon in Paris, the French President Hollande announced that from now on, that coalition would be the sole legitimate representative of the Syrian people, and that's a position that at the moment is ahead of the position of other Western countries. And on another front, and let me connect the two. Today, the BBC published a story on an internal UN report that's going to be made public probably in the next few days on Sri Lanka. No connection with Syria, except that this report is about the alleged abandonment by the United Nations of the people in Sri Lanka toward the end of the conflict. In essence, from the BBC story that was not contradicted by the UN Secretariat, the fact that UN staff pulled out of the areas where the fighting was going on in the last stage of the war made it easier for the Sri Lankan army to kill many people, tens of thousands possibly, in Sri Lanka. I mentioned that piece of news because in a way it does raise the question of the role of the international community in the face of mass atrocities, war crimes, the responsibility to protect, These were questions that I had very much in mind when I was asked by Kofi Annan to join his effort. I mean, as I tell friends, I felt a bit like an oncologist who cannot say, I only deal with the easy cancers. You don't pick and choose, and even if you know that the odds are very low, you've got to try. When we look at Syria today, as Dick was saying, when we have a massive humanitarian crisis. We have apparently about 2.5 million people displaced within Syria. And I can attest to that because destructions are much greater today than when I was involved with the Syrian file earlier this year. But even at that time, walking in the neighborhood in Homs, you could see hundreds of buildings destroyed. So displacement was not a choice, it was a necessity. And since then, the intensification of the war in Syria means that indeed millions of people, hundreds of thousands at least, have lost their homes, and that's why this figure of 2.5 million people displaced within Syria seems very, very credible indeed. Meanwhile, there are, according to official figures, about 400,000 refugees in neighboring countries. And that figure is now rapidly increasing, so that some say it might reach 700,000 by 2013. And the number of dead, it's very difficult to assert a figure, but it's certainly between 30 and 40,000 people, and probably closer to 40,000 than to 30. And in the neighboring countries, we see very serious signs of the impact of the crisis, especially, I would say, in terms of stability of the country in Lebanon. The assassination of a senior Lebanese security official is a very dangerous signal that was sent. And we all know that Lebanon suffered from a very long and cruel civil war, and there is great fear that eventually the civil war that is ongoing in Syria will spill over to Lebanon, and in a way it has already done so. So, how did we get there? It's hard to believe it, but when one thinks of the perception of Assad when he replaced his father, after the death of his father, was that of a modernizer, and it indeed did open the economy, and Syria benefited from some real economic growth for a number of years, a kind of small economic boom that benefited only a small portion of the population, but that was nevertheless there. And Bashar al-Assad was welcomed by people like Tony Blair, Nicolas Sarkozy, when he was the official guest of France on Bastille Day 2008. So you had he was, if not the darling of a number of Western leaders, actually he was seen as a symbol of a possible evolution of Syria. And yet we are where we are now. So I will try to analyze first to analyze why we are where we are now, and then how we can overcome the enormous obstacle, so that the horrific figures that I have quoted don't become even more horrific. I would say in Syria there is a triple fracture: a global, a regional, and a national. And I would want to look at those three levels. And first, the global level. That is a deeply divided Security Council. And I think it's a major factor in the Syrian crisis. And when one looks at that, there is one factor that is often mentioned first, which is the fallout of the Libyan crisis. The notion that, in a way, Syria is a collateral victim of Libya. In some ways, there's some truth in that. But I would want to qualify that. When the resolution that authorized all necessary means was adopted by the Security Council for Libya, none of the members of the Council, those who voted for the resolution and those who abstained, like Russia and China, making it possible for the resolution to pass, none of them expected Gaddafi to last very long. There was a false perception that Gaddafi would fall very quickly. And the fact that it took several months completely changed the political dynamics within the Council and also the posture of the various actors. The Western powers eventually began to present the whole Libya situation as an illustration of the responsibility to protect, and the spin that's connected the R2P to regime change. And that spin, in a way, provoked Russia and China to indeed stress that R2P and regime change are two different concepts, and that the resolution had indeed been interpreted in a very loose way when it became an excuse to have military operation that would eventually lead to the fall of Gaddafi. And that means that both Russia and China, and not only them, but I mean, Russia and China essentially, because they have veto power in the Security Council, have one common concern on the Syrian crisis, which is that regime change should never be decided by foreigners. If there was any hope that Libya had set a new standard for the responsibility to protect, certainly there is the opposite view that it's very important to make the point that no standard has been set indeed. The second reason why there is a deeply divided Security Council is that there is not a credible way forward around which the permanent members of the Security Council can really rally. That being said, I would say that the position of China is not the position of Russia. It's different. For China, the key is stability in the region, the fear of the negative impact on the global economy that another war would have in the region. But China is really emphatically reminds us that it has no particular direct interest in Syria. That is different for Russia, which indeed has interest in Syria. Syria is in a way the last strong ally of Russia in the region. It has significant export contracts of weapons. It has a base. But all these factors, from conversation with Russians, in my view, may not be the most decisive factors. The most decisive factor is probably the fear in Russia, in the Russian leadership, that downfall of Bashar al-Assad would mean the arrival of an Islamist regime. And there are deep suspicions in Russia that the smooth transition that some Western powers think is possible in Syria would not happen. And the Russians believe that because they look at other transitions and they don't see Westerners, so to speak, as great experts in transitions. They look at countries that are very different, from Afghanistan to Egypt to Libya, and in none of those cases are they completely reassured by the way the transition has gone. And so they don't take the word of Western powers that let's get rid of Mr. Assad and we'll all be fine. They don't believe it, and then they think of what the worst case scenario would be for them, because they're not sure that they would have such a completely decisive influence on the regime. And the worst case scenario is really a situation in which eventually they accept the Western position, assuming the Western position is totally clear. They accept the Western position, and then they don't deliver. And then they will have lost an ally, and they will have gained nothing. And that's the worst case scenario for them. So the preferred policy option is, in a way, what they say publicly. We are not wedded to the regime of President Assad, but so we do accept the possibility of change, but it has to be through an internal negotiation. It cannot be imposed from outside. And I think there is no secret there. What they say in public is the fundamental element of their policy. And so we see a Security Council that at the moment has really no common ground. And you could even see it in evidence in the last few days when there was a draft statement produced by Russia that could not be accepted by the Western powers. A draft statement produced by the Western powers cannot be accepted by Russia, even on very modest documents, issuances by the Security Council, not resolutions, but just press statement, which is really the lowest level of authority, pronouncement by the Council. The Security Council today cannot agree. And so it's no surprise that then the international pressure is minimal in such a situation. The second reason is a deeply polarized region. And for me, that's maybe actually the most distressing factor. After the fall of Saddam Hussein, one could say that there's been now a kind of Cold War has set in the Middle East between Iran and essentially the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf countries. And certainly for those countries which have seen the fall of Saddam Hussein as a major strategic gain for Iran, there is a key goal is to roll back that advance of Iran, to push back Iran. And Syria is a battleground in that battle. Syria is a battleground where there is a possibility to inflict a strategic defeat to Iran by cutting Iran off from its protege, the Hezbollah in Lebanon, and therefore a front line with Israel. And the very fact of the defeat of Assad in Syria would show that Iran influence in the region is not what Iran claims it could be. And Iran sees exactly that. And that's why allowing such a defeat would be a very bad thing for Iran. And so there is a kind of mortal battle between the two camps. Meanwhile, Turkey is a different situation. While Saudi Arabia or Qatar, if there is a protracted conflict in Syria, the direct consequences for the Gulf countries, are not too painful. It's quite different if you have a long border with Syria, and so Turkey has a much stronger interest in resolving the conflict, I would say, than the Gulf countries have. It's a different situation. But at the same time, Turkey is caught between conflicting interests. On the one hand, it has to continue in its policy of increasing its influence in the Arab world, and it sees taking a position on Syria as part of that influence and of its credibility. At the same time, it continues to have the Kurdish problem, and not surprisingly, the Syrian government sees that, and it's a weak point for Turkey, because some support to some of the Kurdish groups, and those who are, and the one who is close to the PKK, considered as a terrorist organization by Turkey, the EU, and the US. That support is either threat to Turkey. Interest in other groups is a problem in another way, because it means that the possible fragmentation of Syria would give a more pressing dimension to the Kurdish issue. And so I think that explains in part the sort of ambivalence of Turkish policies in Syria. And last but not least, of course, the more the conflict becomes acute, the greater the responsibilities for the Turkish army, and the present Turkish leadership has been keen to minimize the role of the army in Turkish politics. And so this crisis, in a way, puts in jeopardy some of one of the significant gains, political gains of the government in the management of internal Turkish politics. Israel knows that it has minimal influence on the conflict. It is a spectator, but it is confronted to a new situation where, in a way, the weakness of its neighbor, becomes a greater threat than the strength of a neighbor. And that may, in the long term, raise new issues in the way Israel thinks of its strategic long-term interests. As for the Western powers, they are caught between two concerns: the concern of their public opinion, which is outraged by what the news cycle brings every day about Syria, and the priority that is given to the nuclear crisis with Iran, the priority of making sure that there is no proliferation in the region, which is of a much higher degree of importance for Western powers than whatever happens in Syria. And that certainly complicates the situation, because it means that when dealing with Iran, you have the nuclear file and you have everything else. And the fear that everything else could become connected with the nuclear file. And so what happens is that the nuclear file, in a way, dominates the policies on everything else, which makes the whole regional management more complicated. The third dimension is Syria itself, the fractured nature of the Syrian polity. I mentioned the recent Doha meeting, which is indeed a progress, but let's not forget that deep divisions remain. And one that I would like to emphasize, because it's my view, it's not mentioned with sufficient emphasis, is the generational divide in Syria. The fact that this country has about 65% of its population under 35. And that when you look at Syrian politicians, many are in their 60s, some in their 70s, and some in their 80s. And it doesn't take great political scientists to think that a politician in his 80s may not be the one who will resonate the most with people in their 20s or 30s. Maybe, but that would be surprising. And more substantively, it means that a number of Syrian politicians, their world is a world of Nasser, of Arab nationalism, of debates of the 60s and 70s, and they're not necessarily in sync with the discussions of Syria in the 21st century. And that's a serious issue because it means that when you talk to a category of people, you're not sure you're talking to the people who will control the streets, who are on the barricades in Aleppo, Hama, Homs, or Damascus. And that deep generational divide is a very important issue. The divide between internal and external, I don't need to insist upon it. The recent Doha meeting is a real progress in that respect. The three personalities that were appointed have real credence within Syria. I know one of the three very well, Riyad Saif. Is a very impressive man who knows that there cannot be, who is not himself an Islamist, but who knows that it would be foolish to think of any Syrian opposition that would not make a big space for the Islamists, but who also knows the complexity of talking about Islamists. That, for instance, the Muslim Brothers are in Syria much weaker than they are in Egypt, because the persecution in Syria was much harsher than in Egypt. And so you have Islamists in Syria, but they did not take the label Muslim Brothers for many years. They don't want to be hijacked by those Muslim Brothers who were in the Gulf countries or in Europe while they were in Syria. And having someone like the former Imam of the Umayyad Mosque as the leader is a shrewd move, because it's someone who has real credibility among the Islamists and in Syria, while being a true Syrian who has been in Syria all those years. And one of the bases of this strengthening of the Islamists is one practical reason, because this meeting in the mosque was the place where you can meet in a regime where you can't meet anywhere else, and also because the ethical dimension of the resistance to the regime is a very important dimension. Not so much democracy as justice. And so the religious sentiment there fits very well. And that's one of the reasons why the Islamists have captured so much of the audience in Syria. But the divisions are deep also, of course, between the Kurds and the Arabs. It was interesting to see at a meeting of the opposition in Cairo in early July how the Kurds could not, the Arab majority could not agree on some of the demands of the Kurds, and that is an open question, how the Kurdish issue would be accommodated in a post-Assad Syria. And then the divide between the opposition and the power base of Assad. That is, the minorities who are not necessarily aligned with Assad. It would be wrong to consider that the Christians are necessarily aligned with Assad. That is not correct. That is an oversimplification. But as the conflict goes on, they more and more feel that their future is at risk. And so they are pushed in the direction of Assad. And of course, the Alawites, who have not necessarily all benefited from the regime, but they are very fearful that if the Assad regime goes, they would be in a terrible situation. And they may not be wrong. So how does one overcome that, those obstacles? On the first level, the global level, the Security Council level. When I look back at the period when I was working with Kofi Annan, it essentially ended with a meeting in Geneva on the 30th of June of this year, where a declaration was adopted that in a way is the basis of what the Security Council could rally around. It talks about a Syrian-led transition. And of course you can say, as you can say of any diplomatic document, these are just words. But it's important that countries like Russia and China agreed nevertheless to use that word transition, because transition in good English means something. It means that you move from one state to another. And so even if then you reassure your protégé that indeed that doesn't mean that the president must go or anything of that sort, it is a signal that you're prepared to consider the word transition. The fact that it was agreed that that transition should be by mutual consent, you can say these words concede too much to those who protect Assad. You can say if you do not have the resources to effect regime change, what else is there than mutual consent, a negotiation? And I personally think that in a country where there is a significant percentage of the population that is not behind the opposition, any other solution will mean horrendous fighting and a protracted war. So mutual consent is the inevitable if one wants to avoid a protracted conflict. It says, this declaration, all government institutions, including the intelligence services, have to perform according to human rights and professional standards and operate under leadership that inspires public confidence under the control of the transitional governing body. Under leadership that inspires public confidence. So that is also recognition by the key powers of the Security Council that maybe what's out there is not right. You can say all this is very delicately put, very politely put in the face of all the atrocities that are happening, but there is a basis there. And Lakhdar Brahimi, the present envoy, recognizes that, in a way, that's what he would want to aim toward. Because, and there is a basis because when you look at the key positions of the P5, they have one joint interest. They don't want an extremist regime in Syria. And so on some fundamental issues, they have an agreement. Where they fundamentally disagree on the way to get there, because again, there is no path at the moment. To overcome the obstacles, one has to overcome also the polarization of the region. And that may be much more difficult. Annan's view, which I fully supported, was that Iran should be in the tent rather than outside. Now, this is a minority view at the moment among Western powers. For the reasons I mentioned, because there's a great fear that if you do that, linkages will appear with the nuclear issue, and you will weaken your position on the nuclear issue, which is of much more strategic importance, and you don't want to take that risk. And so the United States, France, United Kingdom are adamant that Iran is only part of the problem and can in no way be part of the solution. I personally disagree because for the same reasons I think there has to be a negotiated settlement, because I think it's such a mortal battle between Iran and the Gulf countries that none of the sides will accept defeat. And both sides have the capacity to keep the fight going. And so I think if one wants a conclusion, there has to be some engagement with Iran. It has to be done carefully, but I think that it will not work in the notion that you could, any other option means the total defeat of one side, and I think it's not going to happen because of the balance of power on the ground. And the third point, of course, is a different approach to the internal dynamics of Syria. What has been striking so far is that there has been a lot of rhetoric among Western powers and little action, and more rhetoric and less action, the more rhetoric. And I personally believe that is dangerous because it raises expectations, it hardens position, and doesn't bring us any closer to a stalemate, and more importantly, to the perception that there is a stalemate. I think there is the beginning of a stalemate, but I think there is no perception of a stalemate. There is a beginning of a stalemate because none of the two, I mean there are more than two sides, but none of the two main, let's say the opposition, to simplify, and the government has a capacity to crush the other. I think the Syrian government has the capacity to reassert its authority wherever it decides to do so, but it cannot do it in all places at once. But it can always reclaim a territory at some point. It cannot reclaim the whole territory. And I doubt that the opposition has the capacity to control the country. It doesn't. It has the capacity to control a significant swath of territory, but not the whole territory. So there is an emerging stalemate, but there's certainly not the awareness of that stalemate. Both sides are still convinced that they can win. And there's a bit of bluster, but I think there's still that conviction, and so long as there is that conviction, or at least the conviction that the negotiation is not in their interest, then the war will go on. So where to go from there? What to conclude? I'll make 3 points. One, on the assessment of the situation and the time frame, a way following on what I just said. In the Syrian army, there are about 27,000 officers, of which only 4,000 were Sunni. A number of them have defected, the Sunnis. Extremely few Alawite officers have defected. It means that the officer corps in the army is becoming more homogeneous. And that tells you something about the likelihood of an imminent collapse. Of course, at the soldiers' units, there are many units with, which are not reliable. That's why the government cannot crush the whole opposition, because the units it can really rely upon are not so many. But there is a hard core that it can count on, and that is now complemented by militias of Shabiha, and and there are mixed, combined operations sometimes of militias and army. So the time frame, the quick ending, I think is unlikely. Although the financial pressure increases, but for the regional reasons I mentioned, it's not going to bring an immediate collapse. Second point, the role of the United Nations. Back to the Sri Lanka comparison. I think the UN was right. I mean, the UN was a decision of the Security Council to pull out the observer mission. Having an observer mission in the middle of a shooting war with such conflicting operations, it's a miracle that no military observers were killed. It's absolutely miraculous. And I think the UN must remain engaged, but not with the idea that it's going to be a sequence, that you will have a ceasefire and then a negotiation and peace. Probably it's going to be a negotiation in the middle of fighting. A revolution does not stop for a negotiation. And if there was a ceasefire, it would immediately mean demonstration, occupation of the public space, which is precisely the mortal threat that the regime cannot tolerate. So it's a dynamic situation, and for that reason, it's not amenable to a sort of sequential approach. And in that sense, probably the 6-point plan has been overtaken by events. You will need to negotiate in parallel as the fighting goes on, and I think that's what Brahimi is trying to achieve through proximity talks. Third, I think we have to recognize that the influence of Western powers on the conflict is limited in reality. It's limited for reasons of credibility, because that conflict is as much about justice than it is about democracy, and that the credentials of Western powers on justice are not high, are not perceived as very high in the region, and so I think we should not be naive. We will be used, but we will not be key players as Westerners in the region. And it's probably true, actually, of many other situations in the Arab Spring, which doesn't mean that we need to just walk away. I mean, I'm a strong believer that we need to continue to push, but we have to accept that when the fighting stops, we will be disappointed by what emerges from the post-crisis settlement, most likely. But I think as a moral duty, engaging through the United Nations, through Mr. Brahimi, is fundamental, because I believe that when the awareness of the stalemate comes, there will be very much the facilitation of a third party will be very much needed to cobble together Syria. And I think the alternative of a fracturing of Syria would have immense consequences on the region. And there I come back, and maybe I conclude on that, on the Kurdish issue. The Kurds, as we know, are present in 4 countries: in Iraq, in Syria, in Turkey, and in Iran. For many of them, they think it's a historical moment, what's happening in Syria. But if it is not managed cooperatively between the 4 countries I have mentioned, it has the potential to really create a long period of instability in the region. And so I think it's another argument to say that Iran has to be part at some point of the solution in Syria. And I will stop there.
Well, thank you very much, Jean-Marie. That was a very rich exposition of all of the challenges that we're dealing with. I have a number of questions for you that I will maybe throw out a few, and then we will open it up to the audience. I wanted to start with this question of ripeness of a conflict. And you spoke about the idea that neither party at this point, if we speak broadly in terms of 2 parties, sees the situation as having reached a stalemate. And if we think about what we know from negotiation theory, we know that there's a moment of a stalemate as maybe the chance when a conflict is ripe for resolution. So I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about if there are ways in which Brahimi can in fact ripen the conflict and make it more amenable to resolution, or do you think that the parties within Syria have to sort of fight to that point? And how do you think the new emergence of this new opposition, as it's been articulated, what effect does that have? And if the parties domestically are not inclined to lay down arms, then do you think that Brahimi's job then is more about pulling the P5 and regional countries into some kind of consensus? And so does that mean, again, trying to draw everybody back to the Geneva plan? What is that, if you can sort of talk about the mechanics of what would be involved? Then I'm wondering if we can step back a bit, because this morning when I heard about this report on Sri Lanka, it also seemed so resonant. The doctrine of responsibility to protect seems to tell us we should be doing something more than we are. So I'm wondering if you could share with us a bit your take on various instruments of more aggressive intervention that seem to have been on the table for a while, or still on the table, from safe havens to no-fly zones, more aggressive supporting of rebels, which seems to be more of an option on the table after the French discussion this afternoon. Is there a way to be surgical about the use of force, or is it simply a slippery slope once one takes military action? I mean, as you read about this conflict, you get the sense that everybody says we need to do more, and then everybody says, but there's no military solution. So is there a way to kind of thread that needle? And do you think there's a point when the violence on the ground becomes so bad that foreign armies simply must act? Or is there some kind of red line that you see? Because the other alternative, it seems to me, and many students at SIPA will read or have already read Edward Luttwak's argument about giving war a chance. And I'm wondering if one interpretation of this is simply, as I was suggesting, that the parties just have to fight to a moment of stalemate. So I wonder if you could talk a bit more about that. And to what extent, when you were speaking about the Security Council politics of this, are there some harder lessons that we might need to learn? I mean, is this kind of a Kosovo moment in which it seems that perhaps the Security Council, there are simply fundamental disagreements and differences in interests, in particular between the Russian Chinese and the rest, in a way that suggests that the Security Council is simply not the platform through which really effective intervention can be brokered anymore. And then my final question for you is about the question of a day after plan. Is there a day after plan? I mean, as far as you understand it, for the moment which we thought, many of us thought would come sooner, of the Assad regime falling. I mean, I've heard that Brahimi has talked about, is trying to figure out if a peacekeeping force might be ready, if some 3,000 troops. What is your sense about what kind of conversations are happening politically but also practically around the moment after the regime might fall? Who will fill that space, securing of chemical weapons, provision of humanitarian assistance? Do you think that if a moment came at which the regime were to fall, greater consensus would emerge on the Security Council about next steps, since we would move past this question of responsibility to protect and regime change being conflated? So let me leave it at that, and then we'll open up the floor.
Thank you. Well, lots of difficult questions. Ripeness of conflict, and I think the difficulty there is you have to get a little more granular on who you talk to, and then I come back to my point, the generational point, and the structure of the Syrian opposition. The problem of a regime that left zero public space is that people who engage in politics in Syria are in a dilemma. If ever they are tolerated, they are immediately suspected of being stooges of the government, even if they are not. but that diminishes their credibility very quickly. And if they are not, well, it's a complicated business to do politics secretly and organize meetings, talk to people. And so there is a practical issue for the for potential political leaders in Syria is to connect with each other, because at the moment they can do it only in a clandestine manner. And those who are public, like Hassan Abdulazim and Coordination Council, they may be very respectable people, but the fact that they are tolerated undermines whatever the authority they might have, and so Hassan Abdulazim is already in his 80s, so is one of those who may not be, the natural leader for younger Syrians. So you have a problem of who leads whom, and there's another issue too, which is the growing divide between the military wing and the political wing, which is also a very serious concern. And there, the way support is given to Syrians matters a lot, because it can be done in a way that empowers the civilian leadership or empowers those who are good at shooting. And that will not have the same results. So I think because of all those complexities, I don't think there is a clear sense in a well-identified leadership that this is the time to negotiate. And as for the other side, the government side, I think from what we know, there are deep divisions on what tactical division on what needs to be done. There are those who think that too much softness was shown in the early stages of the uprising, and that now the regime is paying for that, and it's important to reassert authority so that people are fearful again, because a dictatorship can live only if there is fear, and if people lose fear, it's very dangerous. And I remember people telling me in Damascus, now the wall of fear has fallen. And so I think there's a great desire on the part of the regime to reestablish that wall of fear and do whatever it takes to do that. Now, in terms of peacemaking strategy, focus of P5 or the opposition, frankly, I think one needs to work on both ends, and I think that's what Brahimi is doing. If the not just the P5, but the key regional actors, if the international community is as deeply divided as it is now, the hope of a coherent opposition is very low, because the fighting between the actors of the international community will just amplify the divisions within the opposition, because each will have his protégé, his favorite opponent, and so the two have to work in parallel, I think. Practical measures to alleviate the human suffering. I'm one of those who thinks that the only effective way of protecting civilians is to have regimes which are not a threat to them, and so is to have to fix the politics. And I think, not everybody shares that view, but I personally believe that the notion that you could have a kind of humanitarian policy that would be distinct from the politics in Syria is not practical. There are in the Syrian Red Crescent, there are very brave people at the operational level. Those who are in the ambulance and who do the work. The top level is controlled by the government. You have people who are trying to do their best to alleviate suffering, and several instances have paid with their life for doing that. But you cannot expand the role of humanitarians a lot in Syria, because that would be for the government, that would be tantamount to losing control. And that's precisely what they don't want. So they very well understand, very well that creating more humanitarian space will be infringing on their political control. So I think that unfortunately the notion that you could insulate a humanitarian approach will not work, and for a good reason from the government standpoint. Military measures to create a measure of safety, a no-fly zone over the whole of Syria. Frankly, I think it would be a major military operation because the Syrian air defenses are not insignificant, one. And two, it would not make a huge difference because there are many ways. I mean, it's true that Syrian government uses helicopters, fighter aircraft, and the rest, but there are many other ways to crush a neighborhood than helicopters and fighter jets, artillery, mortar, and so I don't think it's such a. I don't think it's viable unless you make a huge commitment. That huge commitment, you would need to have a Security Council resolution. I doubt that Western powers would be willing to repeat the Kosovo situation, to go ahead without formal authorization of the Security Council, and then we are back to the division of the Security Council. More limited actions such as safe havens. I could see how, I mean, along the border with Turkey, you could have a kind of limited de facto area which would be protected essentially from Turkey, on the basis of self-defense and so stretching it possibly. That might be something that would happen. It would have more a political implication than an operational one, because it would mean that there is a territory that is safe in which a government can be established. So politically, it would have some significance, but it has risky implications for Turkey, because what happens in that area, does it spread to to some Kurdish area? I mean, it becomes a very messy situation. So I think there'll be a good deal of hesitation before going that way. Are we in a Kosovo moment? I already almost answered that question, but not completely. I don't think that there is such a fundamental conflict of interest between the P5. I don't think so. I think there are principles that Russia and China are keen not to consolidate. I think there is a genuine concern about the day after, and the lack of credibility of Western plans for the day after. So there are certainly deep divisions on how you get there, but I'm not sure that there's a fundamental divide. Which brings me to your last question. Well, I would say that if there was to be a day after, I think there could be unity in the Council, because then there will be a very strong interest in managing the situation, in avoiding and preventing things from unraveling. And then the key issue will be to avoid, revenge killings, to have a stabilization. So probably you would want to have some kind of peacekeeping mission to provide some reassurance. but that reassurance would be credible only on the basis of a political agreement. No military force interposing itself will provide any credible security. What might provide a measure of security would be a combination of a political agreement with various stakeholders, with the reassurance then of an impartial outside force to back it. And that's something that probably would get consensus among the P5. What will not be so easy will be the fourth generation, frankly, because would there be much appetite to deploy in what would inevitably a very volatile situation where you will have Al-Qaeda elements, where you will have jihadist, it's not enormously appealing for troops to deploy. And so when my successor in the Department of Peacekeeping will have to work very hard to mobilize such a force. But I would think that a possible agreement between the P5 would be could be considered, but that would require, again, back to Iran, that agreement will happen only if in the background of a measure of compromise among the various regional powers. Then Turkey there can play a role, because Turkey manages its relations with Iran. Turkey, as I said, is not in the same position as Saudi Arabia or Qatar, and so there are possibilities there. But on the Western side, it requires an evolution of the Iranian file, where the fear of a nuclear Iran is sort of fades away. I mean, a solution is found so that this threat is addressed, and for the moment the whole thing is in limbo and nobody knows exactly how it's going to go. So if that is not resolved, it will be very hard to have that kind of settlement for Syria.
Excellent. So I think what we're going to do now is ask people to please line up at the microphone on this side of the room, and we'll take questions. And if you could please let us know who you are, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm Rhonda Haubin, and I both take some courses at Columbia, and I'm also a correspondent, a UN correspondent, who's been watching and writing about all this. And I have two questions. And one, I guess I would have appreciated there being another piece to this presentation, which is the people who feel that the outside intervention is a problem. So a piece of my question is that Saudi Arabia, Qatar, that they are, and the US, France, Britain, there's basically, the intervention is that there's funding, there's arming, and there's the support of the people, the fourth force you mentioned coming in. And so it's not quite what it seemed like you presented, which is that it's just these young people who want a different government and are politically having problems. Because I thought a lot of it's also a secular country, and there's, so that it's a very complex situation with outside intervention. And so I guess the question I have is there a reason that you didn't mention any of that? That somebody who was in the military on the ground said that he talked with a lot of different people and who were in the opposition, the armed opposition, and they said they were being paid and getting the checks, and that's why they were doing that. And that, so did you see any of that? Is there a reason that, we're not talking about that as a piece of this panorama. And then the second question I have is, there have been a series of events like what happened in Hula, and I tried to ask this a while ago, but Major General Mood in June 15th at a press conference talked about how he had sent a team into Hula, and the team did a report. And the team had said that there were conflicting viewpoints among the people about who was at the problem and who had caused it. And that it was hard, that he made an effort to gather the facts he could, that there was a more substantial investigation on the ground needed, and that the UNSMITs, the observer mission, the military observer mission, could make that possible. And they were able to do that. And yet that report, it seems, never got to the Security Council, even though they had asked for it in a press statement on the 27th of May. And then somehow a very different situation at the Human Rights Councils took over, which basically didn't say there were conflicting views. It said there was only one party at fault, and on the basis of very little evidence, really, and no evidence on the ground. So is there some way, do you know about that report? Is there some reason that that report would not get to the Security Council as it had been requested in the press statement that was issued on the 27th of May? And it was said that that report did get to the UN headquarters.
Okay, on your first question, that's why I devoted a big part of my presentation actually to the regional situation, because I do believe that the deep engagement of third countries, the Gulf countries on the one hand, Iran on the other, are a major factor in the crisis. So I think I was very clear on that. I think if there was not that deep divide in the region, the crisis would be difficult, but it would be less difficult to resolve than with the confrontation, the battle that is taking place in Syria. That is a battle also between the Sunni monarchies and Iran. And I think Syria suffers from that battle. On your second question, on the massacre in Hule, first let me say that the difficulty for the observers is that for such situations you need much more than military observers in reality, because you need forensic capacities. You need a range of capacities that military observers don't normally have. In the case of the UN mission, it was actually not quite a first, but almost, that the observers were working hand in glove with human rights officers, and that helped them a lot, and that made them more effective. That being said, in such a situation, there's also the question of witness protection. That is, nobody speaks easily, because there's a fear, if you remain in the area, that you might, there could be retribution. And so that's another difficulty. The Commission of Inquiry, which looked at those situations, interviewed a number of people, including people who had left Syria, so who could feel a little safer. I believe that from all the information I've had access to, there's unfortunately very little doubt on what happened in Hule. That this is a village, a largely Sunni village, surrounded by a number of Alawite villages. This village is on a road that is a key road when you want to go to the coastal area, and including including for dignitaries of the regime. They couldn't go through the village anymore because it was like a thorn in the, and it was not safe to go through the village. And so at some point, there was a military operation with units of the Syrian army around that particular village with roadblocks and checkpoints. And then there were militias who were not stopped at those roadblocks, who went into the village, and people died there. Some people died, and they were eyewitnesses of the military observers. Some were killed by mortar shelling, by artillery, and some, and if my memory is correct, when I don't have the report with me tonight, but I think maybe there was one helicopter, I'm not sure, but some were killed, let's say, from a distance, and some were killed at very close range, so were essentially executed. There was some said that because the eyewitness, the villagers, some mentioned people with beards, so there was a suggestion that that these were Islamists and not Shabiya. There have been extensive research, including done by Human Rights Watch, has done a very good work on Syria, which demonstrates that this notion that if you have a beard, you're an Islamist, and the Shabiya have no beards is just not true. And so, personally, I have no doubt that unfortunately this was a sectarian massacre. Whether it was planned or whether it was just let happen by the authorities, there's no way to tell. In a court of law, one would need to have much more evidence than what could be gathered. But what is clear is that there has been several sectarian massacres. There have been some committed by the opposition too, with also summary executions done by the opposition. So you have had much more of those massive human rights violations by the government. You have also had a number committed by the opposition, and the more the conflict continues, the more that's likely to happen.
Thank you. My name is Jay Halvin. I worked at Columbia for 15 years. I'm retired now. I had the same discomfort as the previous speaker. I feel that this is a contentious issue and that there are two narratives, and we heard only one of the narratives. Had we invited Jafari, the Syrian ambassador, we would have heard a different narrative. And the problem with the narrative we heard is it wasn't a UN narrative. It didn't refer to non-intervention. It didn't refer to the sovereignty of nations. It referred to a country as a regime. That's not diplomatic or normal language. Syria has a government, a long-standing government, has its army, has its problems and its solutions, and that we're trying to deal with a solution to the current problem. And so we have to be careful not to slip into the rhetoric that defines what the solution should or has to be. He should go. But that's not the Syrian solution to the problem, because the army hasn't said Bashar al-Assad should go, and many of the people haven't said Bashar al-Assad should go, and it's a Syrian question. So my question is slightly different. My question is, where is the UN? In 1947, when Greece said that its neighbors were infiltrating and supporting the uprising against it, the UN Security Council sent an investigation mission to the border. And they came back and they said, yes, there's an internal insurrection and there's support for it external to Greece, and we should try to do something. I don't know that they did anything. But where was such a commission? Syria, as a member of the UN, complained that there was outside intervention in its nation. Where was the Security Council investigation of those complaints? That was a very early complaint. And I think it continues that there's a narrative that says the Syrian government is the main problem. And there's a narrative that says Syria has a problem and needs to solve it, but the rest of the world should be kept at bay so that it doesn't interfere and impose a solution. So I thought we lost something in the one-sided presentation, and we need the UN in a question so that the UN standards and the UN Charter are brought back. Thank you.
Now you raise an interesting question. When the UN is an organization of states, with the charter start with "we the people," and so there's always an ambiguity whether you talk about states or you talk about the interests of the people. In the specific conflict of Syria, I think for a while, frankly, there was no intervention whatsoever. For several months, there was no intervention. There was the first massacre in Deraa. President Assad called upon a senior cleric who happens to be from Deraa to go see what there had been this crisis in Deraa. He came, so this senior cleric went to Deraa to look at the situation, and then went back to President Bashar and recommended a number of actions. And then there was a shooting in Deraa where more people were killed. And there was no Saudis or Qataris, and that particular cleric then broke with the, I'm sorry to say, the regime, brought with the official authorities of Syria. And there was no intervention at the time. It was just poor management of a situation in a town that would not be necessarily hostile to the regime. And that continued, situation like that continued for a while, and there were demonstrations which were harshly repressed by the authorities. And then it became, it acquired an international dimension with outside countries such as the Gulf countries seeing an opportunity there and getting engaged. And today it is that combination of internal dynamics and external dynamics that is the reality of the situation. So I think it would be wrong to ignore the international dimension of the crisis, and I don't think I minimized it, on the contrary. But I think it would be also completely wrong to ignore the enormous, national dimension of it. That is the fact that this is a country which has, in terms of abuse of human rights, is probably one of the worst in the world. One has to acknowledge that, with a network of secret jails, with torture and horrible treatments. That the mass human rights violations are probably not what triggered the uprising, frankly. I think among the key factors is more the increased corruption of the authorities, with the fact that there has been a perception that more and more it was a very narrow circle of people who have benefited from the economic development that was the result of some of President Bashar policies. And that sense of injustice and privilege for a few has been a very important factor. The father of Bashar al-Assad had developed policies that were quite different and that benefited for a while the whole of the country. But this has been lost, and that's certainly one of the elements in the uprising. And of course, the sense that in other countries similar uprisings were happening, and so a sense of empowerment of people. But it would be, I think, and I know that a number of Syrian officials say that indeed this is all external, and if there was no external involvement, we'll all be a happy family. I think if that was the case, it would never have developed into what it is.
Hi, my name is Christina Hawatim. I'm a first-year MIA. There were popular protests today in Jordan. To what extent do you think that the international policy and the U.S. security policy, given their relationship with Jordan, will change vis-a-vis Syria if these protests continue?
I think, you know, for Jordan is a country with Palestinians. I mean, it's the mix in Jordan is a very complex one. And Jordan, vis-a-vis Syria, is in a very delicate situation. Jordan does not want to be a frontline state, although it is by geography. But Jordan would rather, not be impacted by the Syrian crisis. I don't know enough of the internal Jordanian situation to really have an assessment of how it's going to affect the stability of the country and what would be the reaction of the U.S. government. I don't know enough to answer that question. Sorry.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Yiğit Canay. I'm a first-year MIA student here at SIPA. You mentioned the security and ideology-oriented factors behind the motivations of different actors in the region. But I'm surprised that no one speaks really about what's economically at stake at Syria. So if you do think that there is something also economically at stake in Syria, what can you identify those things? And maybe if you ever apply this economic level of analysis in understanding the actor behavior during your mediation efforts with the rest of the Annan team. My question could be also rephrased with some of the news in line with the news articles. Is the 2010 struggle in Syria is really about bringing the Qatari natural gas to Europe, eliminating Russia and Iran's effectiveness in the market, and also scaling back their influence in the region?
You know, I doubt those explanations, to be honest. I think, Syria, the economic resources of Syria will, maybe become a net importer, actually, of oil. It has a production, but with the if the economic development of Syria was to resume, for the moment, of course, it has collapsed. But if it was to resume soon, it would be an importer of oil. So, you can say for Libya, there's obvious high economic stakes. Libya being a major oil producer in relations to the size of its population. In Syria, you have no such question. So pipelines, you don't go. I don't think you would have a war for that. I think the Qatar, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iran relationship, that's a big strategic issue. Now, do you analyze it in economic terms, in religious terms? Who is Shia, Sunni, a guardian of the holy sites? You can have several dimensions of it, but that's a much bigger issue than getting a pipeline through Syria, in my view.
Hi, my name is Aline. I'm a first-year MIA. I have several questions. I'll start with the first. You mentioned that the conflict has started to spill over into Lebanon. I was wondering to what extent you think the conflict can affect Lebanon, and what would be the factors that would lead to that impact. Is it Lebanon's internal politics? Is it the extent to which the Ba'ath regime wants to send a message to the rest of the world? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's a matter of mix, the religious mix in Lebanon and geography. That is, you have, and the geography of Syria too. You have through the Bekaa Valley. If you extend it toward the north, and you get into some parts of Syria, where and the Alawite Mountain, and so there you have you don't have a continuum at the moment, but you have the possibility of one, and not to remodel states, but in terms of support to various groups, just right. As the Sunni insurgency can get support from Sunni areas in Lebanon, you could see how Alawites could get some support from the areas of Lebanon that are controlled by the Hezbollah. And then, of course, there's the fact that Lebanon is a product of of great power diplomacy at the end of World War I, a mandate, the French carving a Christian-dominated country. A number of Syrians have never accepted that and believe that this was a ploy, which it was, of imperialist countries. So the relationship between Lebanon and Syria has never quite stabilized because of the very history of the two countries. And so when the compact of one country is challenged, inevitably it impacts on the other country.
Right, but my question is more, do you think that it's about the internal dynamics of Lebanon and how the leaders in Lebanon will manage the situation to keep the various parties in Lebanon who are getting caught in the violence calm? Do you think the Lebanese government itself has the capacity to stop the violence from erupting in Lebanon, or is Syria's power and grip on Lebanon so strong that it's kind of out of their control?
I think the Lebanese government has some capacity, but only up to a point. I think so far, they have been working very hard to try to avoid, spread the conflict from spreading into Lebanon, and I think they have acted very wisely to try to avoid that. But one could see how, if worse came to worse, it could be in the interest of some extremists to engulf Lebanon in the conflict, and it could become at some point difficult for the Lebanese government to control the situation. If you had a campaign of assassinations whose attribution is all you can inflame passions and create a cycle of violence that at some point you can't control. I think that's a real risk, no?
Yes, of course. Can I ask one second quick question? So you seem to say that you envision nothing radical taking place, but rather, I'll stick. Oh, forget this. But rather mutual agreements, which involves Iran. I was wondering if you could discuss that in more detail. What exactly do you see taking place? I felt it was a bit kind of general, and as someone from the region, I'd like to get a bit more detail to be not completely hopeless.
You're not reassured by what I said?
Oh, not at all. I'm absolutely terrified of what's going to happen in the next few years in the region. So.
Yeah. Well, it's you have various communities in Syria, and I mean this very word community actually would not be accepted, because one of the achievements of the Syrian regime was in a way to try not to be based on communities, and certainly Syria, I mean, doesn't look at sort of Lebanese model as a model for a variety of reasons.
Understandably so.
Yes. I mean, I heard some Syrians say, well, Lebanon gained the peace and lost the state, which is, I mean, this is a Syrian view of things, but it has its. Syria looks down would look down on an arrangement that would consolidate a sort of community-based approach to peace in Lebanon. At the same time, I think one has to recognize, unfortunately, that indeed, whether people want it or not, they are now identified with communities. That's a tragedy.
With their sect. When you say community, you mean their sect?
Yes.
Right. Okay.
They become identified, even if they don't think that way, and they don't want to think that way. But as the conflict deepens, and people are killed, not what they do, but for what they are, which is the horror of that kind of situation. They have to turn to the people who are like them, and so it's a vicious circle that develops. And if you want to break that vicious circle, unless you have a juxtaposition of militias, you will want probably to have some kind of external reassurance. That is, if you are Alawite in Syria, you will not want just to have a nice commitment from the Sunni majority that they will be fine. That will not be enough. And so having some kind of understanding that the new regime has good relations with Iran, has good relations with Russia, will matter a lot to them as a measure of reassurance. And that's why having the blessing of the various countries, so that the perception is not that with the transformation of the country, that country has suddenly become a protege of Saudi Arabia, or that would not be reassuring. And that's where the external negotiation is linked to the internal one, I think. And then, of course, how it is affected, I think that's for the Syrians with international help to decide. That's why it should be Syrian-led.
Okay, thank you.
Why don't we take two questions together and then...
Sounds good. Hi, my name is Ted Janis. I'm a second-year MIA. Thank you so much. It was very fascinating. My question is somewhat on the same lines. You discussed the fact that at this point we're going to need parallel negotiations, that there needs to be, we can't expect a next step before making some progress. But without this public space you mentioned, it must be very difficult to have meaningful discussions. So what kind of settlement can we expect if the two sides do come to the table? What kind of practical next steps can they take internally? And do you see any historical precedents that we can rely on to kind of guide the way? Thanks.
Well, I mean, when you look at okay, that's fine. First, yeah.
Yeah, I'm Chris Fersetto. I'm also a second-year MIA. There's a number of theories circulating that maybe perhaps Assad's endgame is a kind of a consolidation of Alawites along the coast into an enclave where his support is the highest. I'm wondering if you think there's any legitimacy to those statements, and also if you see the breakup of Syria as a state actually being a possibility at all.
Okay. Now, what kind of settlement in Syria? I think, and is there a precedent? I think the difficulty there is that if you if you told Syrians that the president is Taif, I think you would be walked to the door, because that's exactly what they do not want. And so I don't think there's a real accepted precedent for a Syrian settlement. It would require a combination of geographic devolution of power that is done in a way that guarantees that in some areas there would be, there would be representation for the non-Sunni groups. I think that you would need to have that, to have a reassurance. Would you have some kind of informal assurance where, for instance, for the security services, you have representatives of people who don't have blood on their hands, but who have had responsibilities in the existing structures? Possibly. That has been discussed, actually. Would such arrangements be formal, or would they be implicit? Probably better if they can be kept implicit. But that's where you need a measure of international guarantees, because if it's implicit purely as a national deal, that would not be reassuring enough. But for an arrangement to stick, of course, the key is who ensures your security. And if your security is ensured by the people who were shooting at you the day before, that is not enormously reassuring. And so you would need some kind of informal arrangements. And I have discussed it with some of actually the people who are involved in the opposition, and some are prepared for that, not all. And I think on the government side, some are prepared for that kind of compromise. What is difficult is where you draw the line. Who is absolutely excluded from the deal? And of course, the more the violence continues, the broader the pool of people who would need to be excluded is. And so the more difficult it is to have an arrangement. Now, the scenario of a breakup of Syria, I pray to God that this does not happen. I think it would be catastrophic for the region. I doubt that there is a plan, so to speak, to go to the Alawite Mountain and the coast. It could, in a kind of Bosnia type scenario, it could eventually happen as a result of protracted war. It's the worst case scenario. It would mean immense suffering for everybody, and because Syria, the present regime was not a sectarian regime as such. It's often misunderstood. When Hafez al-Assad took power, he didn't take power to give power to the Alawite. He took power with a certain Ba'ath ideology, which is not at all a sectarian ideology. The regime evolved into a sectarian regime because that's where the base of support was, and out of lack of trust for others. But it was not initially a sectarian regime. And so if you evolve toward a situation of a sort of sectarian divide of Syria, it's a betrayal of everything that the Ba'ath stood for. The Ba'ath ideology is largely dead. It's like the communist ideology at the end of the Soviet Union. It's not much of anything. But it would be a betrayal of that, and more importantly, it would be a an enormous cause of suffering with the ethnic cleansing, because that regime, not having been a sectarian regime initially, you have a lot of mixed neighborhoods. You have people, you also have intermarriages, you have adults, and so the separation would be absolutely atrocious in its human consequences. So I think this is the one thing that everybody who wants to help Syria should fight against.
Okay, so let's take the last 3 questions, and then you can answer those and give your closing comments.
Hi, my name is Ayman Saidi. I'm a second-year MIA student. Thank you for taking the time to talking to us today. I wanted to ask about the humanitarian crisis and the flow of refugees to neighboring countries. We know the political consequences that such a flow, such high numbers can have on the neighboring countries, and Lebanon or Jordan being a point in case of that in the past. What is the feasibility or possibility of establishing humanitarian corridors or safe zones in the country, and not only establishing them but protecting them also, as we've seen in Bosnia that was a problem? Is this something the international community, the P5 and regional powers can agree on or find a common agreement on? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Youssef Farouqi. I'm a first-year MIA student. Given the psychology of the Assad family and the Assad clan, which can be described as kill or be killed, do you think the regime would be desperate, so desperate to use chemical weapons, knowing that they have significant stock of chemical weapons? And what would be the reaction of the international community?
Hello, my name is Florian. I'm a MIA student. I was wondering if you could give us your thoughts on the Chinese 4-point plan and the idea of a phased ceasefire that would be regionally based in Syria, and especially how that would relate to the unity of Syria that has just been discussed, and if it's practical and desirable.
Safe areas. I discussed it a bit on the notion of a safe area along the Turkish border. For me, it's probably the only possible option, and I have deep doubts on it, to be honest. Humanitarian corridors, I don't think it's practical, because it essentially means going to war against the Syrian. Humanitarian corridor has to be defended, and so it's going to war in the most ineffective way, so to speak. I mean, so I don't think it's a practical solution, and I don't think there is any appetite to go to war, and I don't think it would be good to go to war. I think it would solve nothing. I'm not advocating that. Chemical weapons. From what I know, the government has been fairly careful on chemical weapons. I think there have been efforts to separate the precursors from the main weapon, so that the notion of a so that the risk of a chemical weapon being used from one day to the next is not high. I think the government is rational, and I think it's unlikely that it would use chemical weapons. I think there is a higher risk, but the separation of precursors mitigates that risk. There's a high risk that by chance some opposition fighters might get into a base where there would be chemical weapons, and some groups might be tempted to use them. That's a risk. I know it's monitored by the Western intelligence organizations. That would be disastrous, but it is a risk. It's one of the few scenarios in which some surgical action might be taken to try to secure weapons. I could imagine such a possibility. Phased ceasefires. The idea was discussed earlier this year when I was working with the United Nations. I doubt it's a practical idea if it's not part of a broader framework, because otherwise it's really the immediate implication is that you can sort of move forces on the place where there is a ceasefire to push in another area, and that's valid both for the opposition and for the government. So in the absence of a broader framework at a national level, I think you can have very, very local temporary ceasefires, like when, to recover wounded people, I mean, a couple of few hours. That's, yeah, that is possible. But a serious ceasefire, let's say in a city, you say we stop firing in Aleppo, we stop firing, it relieves the pressure in that particular place. And so if you are the government, you will be worried that the opposition will just move assets to increase the pressure in another place, and vice versa if you are the opposition. So it's operationally, I doubt that it's workable.
Any closing thoughts?
Well, closing remarks. I strongly believe that at the heart of the Syrian crisis there is a human rights issue, not in the sense of people being brought to jail, but the fact that the basic dignity of the people has not been respected, and that needs to be addressed. And so, for that reason, I think that the international engagement, in a way, is a secondary factor, but it has become a primary complication, so to speak, in the resolution of the conflict. And I strongly believe that we should continue to be engaged, but in a way that does not further polarize the region. I think there are very few people who have the interests of the Syrians at heart. I think battles that have nothing to do with Syria are being waged in Syria, and the people of Syria suffer from it. And the decent thing is to try to disentangle the Syrian situation, which is difficult enough, from a broader regional confrontation from which Syria cannot gain anything.
Well, please join me in thanking Jean-Marie Gehenna, and thank you all for coming.